My name's Jonathan Stapleton. I'm editor of Professional Pensions. I'm delighted to be joined today by three panellists. We've got Chris Curry. He's the principal of the Pensions Dashboard Delivery Group. Ellie McKinnon, chief executive of the Cheviot Trust, and of course Nigel Peaple, who's director of policy and research at the PLSA. If I can just sort of begin by introducing us to this session. Obviously the dashboard's moving ahead quite quickly now after perhaps 3 years. We have the delivery group that's been set up. But of course lots of questions remain unanswered. We don't know yet when we'll see the very first public iteration of the dashboard, exactly what it will and won't include, and what the data standards will be, nor do we know exactly what the timeline of the project will be. And I hope our expert panel will be able to give us some vision and insight into some of those questions, along with some of the sort of challenges facing schemes. Sadly, as you probably realised, Guy Opperman, Pensions Minister, couldn't join us today. There's some small matter of Brexit going on in Westminster at the moment, but I'm sure our expert panel here will more than be able to answer some of your questions. How we're going to run this session, I'm going to ask each of our panellists to give us a little bit of a presentation outlining their thoughts, and then we're going to open it up to questions to all of you. Chris, can I start by inviting you to sort of use your sort of thoughts where you're going in the delivery group and what we expect to see over the coming year?
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everybody. Very full session, which I think is slightly reassuring that everyone's interested, or everyone's got lots of complaints, not quite sure which. So we'll find out as we go through. I've also been asked to fill in some of the detail that Guy Opperman was going to talk about, and obviously cannot speak on behalf of Guy, and probably won't say exactly the same things as he would say anyway, but help by providing a little bit of background about the dashboard project and how it's been evolving over the years, and a little bit about how it fits into the wider government programme and why engagement is such an important part of that. And then my own thoughts about how we're progressing on the industry delivery group, how we're getting on. I can try and give you some insights in some of those questions that Jonathan mentioned. I don't think I can give you any answers yet, but we'll come on to that when we get to the discussions. So how's the dashboard project, or where have dashboards come from? I think it's probably worth starting with, and it's worth remembering actually the idea and the concept of a pensions dashboard in the UK has been around for actually quite a long time. If you look back to the early 2000s, actually probably during the time of the Pensions Commission, there was a project called the Combined Benefit Pensions Forecast, which was trying to bring together the state pension and initially some private pension projections from the DB side into a single place so you could see it. It was potentially going to be paper-based, but also an electronic version was thought about. It was very difficult to do at that time and didn't get very far, but you can see that concept has been around for probably 15 years or more. More recently, and I think probably in the last 5 years or so, there's been a growing interest both within the industry and amongst government, and initially with the Treasury, about the idea of allowing people to find their pensions and get access to their pension data all in the same place. It's been happening in a lot of different places. The idea of data being portable and people owning their data is becoming much more commonplace, and a pensions dashboard fits squarely within that idea of providing information that individuals should know and own about themselves to allow them to access that and to use it in the best possible way. So the Treasury initially encouraged the industry to start thinking about this. There was the setup of the cross-industry pensions dashboard prototype with heavy involvement from the ABI, but not just the ABI running that and getting together, I think, 19 different organisations to see how that could work. And they delivered recommendations a couple of years ago about how that might work. That then led to a DWP consultation paper based on that. There was then a little bit of a hiatus when I think dashboards maybe weren't as popular within government as they might be now, to put it mildly. And then finally a response to the consultation and a lot more activity towards the end of 2018. And then finally, earlier this year, with a further consultation response that the government DWP published, where they set out their vision of what a pensions dashboard system will look like, and also pass responsibility for creating that infrastructure and for pensions dashboards onto the Money and Pension Service, the newly created Money and Pension Service. And that's where we are now. So there's actually, and I think it's worth mentioning, two different parts of dashboards which have been handed over to the Money and Pension Service. So there's the industry delivery group, which is where I am sat at the moment 2 days a week as principal within that. The task that we have is to create an infrastructure or an ecosystem to allow pensions dashboards to operate in the UK. Now, there are a certain number of parts of that which are taken directly from the Department of Work and Pensions, excuse me, which are kind of policy decisions, which we are working with, which are kind of set in stone almost in what we're doing. So those are that there is a single pension finder service, that there is no manipulation of data once it's delivered to a dashboard, that there needs to be a strong governance ecosystem around dashboards and how they operate, and that there will be multiple dashboards. That's very clearly a policy decision which the DWP has taken and that we are looking to implement as we go forward. The other part of the work that's been devolved to the Money and Pension Service is the provision of a pensions dashboard. And so that's, I think, really to ensure that there is a pensions dashboard out there. So when we create the ecosystem, there's actually somewhere where people can go to access that information. Where does this fit into overall government policy? I think those of you who heard me speak this morning with a different hat on in the Retirement Living Standards session will understand how I see this and why I think this is important. So this is really the next phase in building on top of automatic enrolment. So automatic enrolment has been brilliant at getting people to have pension saving. Not quite so good necessarily at people knowing they've got pension saving or necessarily being able to know how many different pensions they have or how they can track them. And that's where the dashboard comes in. So the dashboard will become the mechanism by which people know that they're saving in a pension, where those pensions are, potentially how much those pensions are worth, and again, potentially how much those pensions might be worth at retirement. So the dashboard is really that way of helping automatic enrolment to become an even more important part of the pension saving system. And the Retirement Living Standards this morning is another step in that direction, as we discussed then. So that's the background. That's kind of how we got to where we are when I started. So I started in July. What I'm going to talk you through now are just a couple of slides of progress so far. And I hate to say this is such a fast-paced world that actually some of the things have changed even since these slides were sent in yesterday. So there's a lot going on. So one of the first tasks that I was set when I joined the industry delivery group was to set up a steering group. And I'm very pleased to say that I think at least 4 members of the steering group in this room today either means that they're very enthusiastic and interested in the dashboards, or they don't trust me and want to make sure I'm saying the right things. I'm hoping it's the former and not the latter. But this is an important group. So the steering group is a bit like the advisory board to help the industry delivery group chew over some of the really important decisions about how the dashboard ecosystem is built. It's deliberately a very diverse group, so we have representation from the pensions industry, from the fintech sector, and most importantly, a very strong consumer representation within that. And that's running right the way through the core of the project. From my perspective, dashboards have to be built in the interest of the consumer. If we're not building a dashboard for consumers, it's not clear to me why we're building dashboards at all. So it's really important that that underpins everything that we do. And it shouldn't be a surprise at all, but that theme came through very strongly at the first steering group meeting, and everyone in that steering group is bought into that principle. We had a very good discussion, very lively and informative discussion. I think one of the key tasks we're going to have to work out pretty soon is, in the technical terms, what the minimum viable proposition or minimum viable product is. So what is it that dashboards can actually deliver, which is going to be of use to the people who we think are going to be using it. That's going to be a challenge for us over the next few months in determining what that is, but actually what that is dependent on a lot of different things. And that's where the next stage comes in, which is actually what's the delivery roadmap that we're setting out here? What are we doing? So we spent the last couple of months, and we'll spend the rest of this year finalising that journey. So to set out what are the stages we need to go through as part of the dashboard project in order to do that. In some parts, that's quite high level. But what we also need to do is to turn that high level down into actions and what we need to do and something around timelines. And this is a bit that's changing. So I said, of course, what we do with the roadmap and how we can deliver and when things are delivered is dependent on a whole range of things. Some are within our control, some are outside of our control. One example of something that's outside of our control is the pensions bill. So I was delighted that earlier this week, firstly, the pensions bill appeared in the Queen's speech. And then secondly, that on Tuesday, it was introduced into the House of Lords, so it's already started its progress to do that, to get through to provide the legislation. Why is that important for the dashboard? Well, it's important in a number of ways. Firstly, it gives the kind of legislative permission to the Money and Pension Service to construct this infrastructure. But more importantly, contained within there are clauses that will require pension schemes to provide the information that's required for the dashboard. And that's a really important part of all of this. Dashboards are only going to be as good as the data that's in them. We could build the best, most technically advanced, most streamlined pensions dashboard system that exists, but if we put rubbish data in the end, the consumers are going to get rubbish out at the other end. So it's really important that the data that's put into the pensions dashboard system is accurate, it's clean, and it tells individuals what they want and what they need to know. So actually the bill is a really important part in what we're doing, and when we can deliver public-facing dashboards, what form those dashboards take, what kind of information they contain, is all in some way dependent on what happens with the pensions bill and that process that is put in place to allow the data to come through from the data providers through the infrastructure we're creating to the dashboards and ultimately to the savers at the other end. So it's a really important part of what's happening. I think what's really positive is that now it's so clear that the pensions bill is out there, and for those of you who saw reports of the briefing which Guy Opperman gave yesterday about the pensions bill, there is really strong cross-party support for all elements of the pensions bill, and both the government and the opposition are very keen that the pensions bill progresses as quickly as possible. I think that's giving notice to us and to those in the industry that this will happen, and that there will be a requirement for you to provide your data in a format that is ready for the dashboard. So you don't need to wait for the legislation to come through. I think there's a very clear signal that it's going to come through. And in fact, it's probably better for you to start now and start thinking about what it is you need to do to get that data ready to enable you to meet the requirements of the legislation when it comes through, and for us to be able to get that dashboard up and running, and for consumers to be able to find their information sooner. Of course, although we have some very wise heads on the advisory group, we have some very wise heads in the industry delivery group, and a lot of expertise within the Money and Pension Service, we're very aware that this is such a diverse and complex project that we don't know all the answers ourselves. And so the way in which we're going to be structuring this project is by creating a large number of working groups. So hopefully a number of you will have seen our request for interest, our expression of interest for people to register if they're interested in supporting these working groups. These will be operating on a voluntary basis, but we'll be drawing on the most experienced people within the industry and the most knowledgeable, most innovative people within the industry to get them to look at specific parts of the dashboard ecosystem and infrastructure, and asking them to give us the benefits of their experience to help inform the decisions which the steering group are taking. So those are going to be starting this year. The first of these is a very important one, again linked to the pensions bill. It's about data standards, so we can let providers know what form of information they're going to need to be providing for us, and kind of what that needs to look like. It might not necessarily exactly what fields you need, but we'll talk about how those fields are defined in doing that. But there are plenty more to come, and again, this is my opportunity to ask as many of you as possible who are interested in this or who work for organisations that have expertise in this area to think about how you can help construct the dashboard. It's a real opportunity to get involved right at the very bottom and to help develop the direction of travel and the way in which the ecosystem and infrastructure is developed over time. And of course, that will then feed back into the advisory group, which then feeds back into me, which then feeds up to the Money and Pension Service Board, and then will result in a wonderful dashboard at some point in the future, or a wonderful dashboard infrastructure that dashboards can use. There are a whole host of working streams that I think we've identified somewhere between 20 and 30, so I didn't want to put them all on one slide because you wouldn't be able to read it anyway, but some of the key ones are around data standards and governance, the technical architecture that we're looking at, the minimum viable product, and now we start to get into jargon, which I'm just starting to get comfortable with, about launch into public beta. So we've got to go through alpha and private beta and public beta and all these different things. One of the most important user journeys, who is going to be using the dashboard and what are they using it for? And understanding what the consumer wants is key to designing something that's actually going to be used by them. Another thorny one, digital ID and verification. How do you authenticate that the person is who they say they are in order for you to safely release their data to them? Is a tricky one that we haven't really bottomed out in the UK context at all. One of the things we're doing is try to learn from overseas experience. The first thing we learn from overseas experience is having a national identity number is a really good shortcut to all of this. Not one that we can take. So there's other options that we're going to be looking at all of this, and of course top of everyone's list is security, and it's really important that people know that the system is secure in doing this. So there's a lot that's going on at the moment, a lot to still be decided. From my perspective, as I said, the key things to bear in mind are that this needs to be consumer focused and consumer facing and in the consumer interest. There's a lot of decisions we'll be taking over the next few months about what can we release which is actually going to be something which is viable. Can we release something which is useful? Does that have to cover all of pensions, or can it cover part of the pensions? Does it have to cover all of the population, or can it cover part of the population? There's a whole host of different ideas, and these are the kind of issues which the advisory group and the working groups will be grappling with over the coming weeks and months. But there is an opportunity for anyone who wants to get involved to get involved. I would ask you all to get in touch if you think you've got something to offer to the project. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Chris. Nigel, what, if I asked you to present the PLSA's view? Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, so as you've heard, my name's Nigel Peaple, Director of Policy at the PLSA. I had the pleasure of being involved with what's now called the Cross-Industry Prototype Group a couple of years ago, which ABI did a lot to support, and thank you to ABI and the audience on that. And recently I was appointed to be on this advisory group that you've heard about. But my points today will be putting forward the points of the PLSA as we've developed them over the last couple of years as we've been looking at this issue. Those of you who are in the plenary just before lunch will have heard some of these themes coming through in the discussion. But before I say anything specifically on the dashboard, I do just want to mention something about how we see engagement within the kind of wider ecosystem of effective tools. So, yeah, we think engagement's very important, especially in the world of DC, but you perhaps won't be surprised to learn that at PLSA, we're equally focused on good governance, effective regulation, not just on engagement. So let's see if I can find the button. And I'll come back to those points in a minute. Right, so there we are. The PLSA is a strong supporter of the Pensions Dashboard project, and we think that to be a success, it needs to do three things in particular. It needs to help people locate their pensions. It needs them to be able to see the value of their pension, ideally in terms of an annual income, and it needs to help savers plan for retirement. And you'll have heard references to the thought that we're keen that planning tools are on the site. It would be lovely if the retirement living standards could be on there as one of those tools. So we very much see it as a find and view tool, at least initially, and we'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment. So above all else, we see it as being saver-centric. We want the dashboard to work in the interest of savers and not to be something for the industry, actually, and not to be something about, encouraging all sorts of behaviours, either desirable or undesirable, from commercial operators. We think it needs to operate in the interest of members. So a few key considerations. We think really it would be sensible to start with a single trusted dashboard run by a non-commercial entity, such as the Money and Pension Service. So we're really pleased that they're doing that. But, this is the 21st century, and people do find fintech tools hugely interesting and engaging. So we think it's right that after we've got that first one up and running, we move on to having all sorts of other dashboards, but we're only at a point where there's an absolutely secure consumer protection regime. Absolutely essential that the state pension is on the dashboard, and then it has equal accessibility with the data from pension schemes. And that's very important because actually for the majority of people in the country, the state pension is their largest chunk of pension income. So we actually think a dashboard without the state pension would be very misleading. Now, it's great that the government has said that they are committed to making the state pension ready as well, but actually there's some blurry wording where it's not quite clear whether it would really be on the same status or whether you'd have to go from the dashboard site off to the state pension site, possibly have a different level of ID protection. I mean, we don't really think that works. We know that people always give up on things once you get an extra hurdle in the way, they don't have the relevant data. So really we want that state pension to be in there with the other pensions in an equal footing so people can see all their pensions and plan effectively for retirement. onboarding timetable. We think we should have a achievable, pragmatic timetable. What's important is to do the thing right rather than to do the thing quickly. That doesn't mean to say that we're not all hugely keen to be getting on with it and moving as fast as we can, but it does mean to say we shouldn't sort of have notional deadlines which don't take account of reality. And the reality, as we all know, is data standards. We're not confident that all the data held in this part of the industry is held clearly and accessibly. There are many old schemes, microfiches, boxes in cupboards, etc. That's the legacy, but the dashboard, of course, would have to require you to have all that information readily connectable to the dashboard. So let's have a sensible timetable. Scheme exemptions, quite a hard line on this. Just as we think it's really important that the state pension's in there, we would like as many pensions as possible to be in there. Some degree of pragmatism, I'm sure, will be needed, and maybe it's about smaller pots or something like that. But anyway, ideally, a comprehensive view. And then to have a comprehensive view, you have to have scheme compulsion. It's something that we all looked at in the last year or two, and insurance and commercial providers sort of said, well, actually, to make the case for doing the dashboard, you have a commercial case, but if it's the law, you have to do it. In trust-based sector, it was lots of trustees worrying about whether it's really in the members' interest to make this data available. But if you make it the law, then it's clearly something you have to do, and that's an effective way forward. A few immediate issues. So the most important and urgent issue is absolute clarity about what is our ultimate objective. Obviously, the DWP set out a clear view in its document from the beginning of this year. And there's an element, as Chris was talking about, where I think that there'll be a sort of stock take on, is all of that the mission, or are there some variations on that? And Chris will be able to talk about that more clearly. But I think listening to him earlier, he was saying, well, there's certainly some optionality in there. But I think it's very, very important that we're super clear on that, straight off, as fast as possible, because until you know that, you can't really deal with any of these other issues. And in particular, you can't deal with the data standards. And if you don't know what the data standards are, then it's really quite hard to prepare for this. Although I do agree with Chris's points and the points made earlier that actually it's high time that we raise the quality of administration within the occupational pension sector. So you're not wasting money if you're getting on and improving that. But it would be really helpful to be clear about what are the data standards we need. And I think those first two, you can always think of the first is like the demand from the project coming from you, and then on the supply side, it's the next one. Data quality is what's the state of our data when we're handing it over, and those two things have to match up. Data security, hugely important. People's pension savings are usually their biggest financial asset, so these need to be looked after, and we need to make sure that as they connect up to the dashboard that it's done completely securely. And there's probably a bunch of legal issues there. Some of them will be overridden by having compulsion in the pension schemes bill when that finally gets passed, but lots of legal issues to work through too. And then briefly, as I said at the beginning, I just wanted to say engagement is part of our overall view. Here are a series of recommendations from our Hitting the Target report last year. Some of those work with behavioural economics, the aspiration to raise automatic enrolment contributions to 12% by 2030, with the bulk of that falling on the employer. And some of those are in the engagement space, such as the retirement living standards you heard about earlier, and efforts to promote clearer communications, such as the simple annual statement on a voluntary basis. That was all I want to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Nigel. Now, Ellie, I was hoping you could sort of talk us through some of the opportunities and challenges you see for the dashboards from the scheme perspective. Thank you.
Try. I'm there, right. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, as Jonathan said, I've been asked just to comment how my trustees are feeling about the dashboard and what we see as the opportunities and the challenges around it. And I'm not going to labour on things like we really need to know what data they need, we need to know what standards, because that's all kind of a given, really. But I think it is that there are some other issues that I think are worthy of just some discussion. The first one is my trustees, and the Cheviot Trust background is as a provider to the legal sector. So I have a lot of lawyers on my trustee board. And that old chestnut about you have 3 lawyers, you have 4 opinions, I can tell you is absolutely clear on my trustee board, but actually not about this one, because actually I think we're all pretty convinced that we think the public dashboard is a great idea. I think we will have some concerns, and I think we will be engaging around the multiple dashboards later, but that seems quite a long way off at the moment. So if we could just get one really good dashboard up and running, we think that would be a really good move. I think we all ought to be aware that this is basically going to be around deferred members, and I think that's sometimes not something that's raised, but the reality is if you're in your employer's workplace pension, you'll probably be quite aware of what's going on there. And so this is going to be something for people who are deferred pensioners who are going to want to go to this dashboard to find all those pensioners. So when you think about the fact that we all know engagement is difficult, engagement with deferreds is really difficult, employers don't want to spend any money on engagement with deferreds, this has to be in all our interests to find a better way of doing this, which is fairly straightforward. I think obviously there may be some changes in deferreds with the Master Trust world, meaning that you can transfer them without consent, but the reality is there's an awful lot of deferred members out there who this is going to be massively helpful from. We've got some additional challenges because we've got lots of employers, but I think that's just part of the journey and part of what we should be doing. But I do think the deferred issue, the fact it's going to be really important for deferreds, means that if you look at your data, it will be your deferred data that will be the less good data. So we are focusing heavily on tidying that data up, and as everyone in this room will know, it's like painting the Forth Bridge, because people don't keep you up to date, and the people who particularly don't keep you up to date are the deferred, so you come full circle. I think we're working on the basis that whatever is put together will satisfy us from a systems and security perspective, but we do think at that stage we will be taking advice to make sure that the trustees' duty under DPA, etc., will be satisfied, and I think that's something that we'll want to look at quite closely, and that's not just because they're all lawyers. I think where we've got some concerns is looking at things like projections and how exactly that could work going forward. And in looking at this, we're really focusing on, we want this dashboard to be a really helpful tool for members. And what we don't want is this dashboard to be a tool that might mean members take the wrong decision because the information is presented in such kind of fairly vanilla format that they don't have enough information to take an informed decision. So moving on, the reason I'm particularly concerned about this, and this is a slide that's produced by the Financial Reporting Council, which looks at what assumptions have been used for SMPI statements. Now, when you talk about the dashboard, people kind of say, well, the DC will be easy, won't it? And then the DB will be more complicated. But this is 21 providers, but covers 30 million SMPI statements. And it's showing you the range of assumptions that were made for those top 4 types of asset class. Now, when you look at it, you think, well, okay, it's probably fairly reasonable to have a fairly wide range of assumptions for equities. You could kind of buy that. But so that's about sort of 2 and a bit. But then you look at government bonds and corporate bonds, and is it really realistic that there's a 2% range in those assumptions? And perhaps even more surprisingly, I'd love to know who's projecting 3% for cash. I really would. But that goes from 0.5% to 3%. Now, we all know the cumulative effect of those assumptions. So if we put projections on and everybody's doing their own thing, you can see they're going to get wildly differing figures. And the risk is, I think, that you get members who will take the wrong decision because they're thinking, oh, well, that one's growing quicker than that, so therefore I'm going to go for that one because they're projecting a bigger figure. And I think that's a really dangerous angle, which I think we can address, but what do we do? Do we standardise assumptions, which feels a bit like a backward step, to be honest? Or do we have to do something? Because that range just looks very scary. So where we get to is we are also concerned about the communication, so that kind of goes around the assumptions. And in fact, one of my trustees, who I was talking about this yesterday to, said that he sees it as if we just all use our own assumptions and those projection numbers are very clearly on the dashboard, that it could be the next mis-selling scandal. Now, he is a lawyer and cautious by nature, but I think he was really genuinely concerned that people could make the wrong decision. So this really needs to be very carefully thought about. And I'm sure it's something that Chris is already thinking about, but it is something that, as a trustee, we're worried about because we take a lot of time and care looking after our members, and we don't want to put them out into something that is going to potentially lead them to make the wrong decision. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's the trustees' responsibility. It's our data and how it's used. You know, we need to be comfortable that it's being used. One thought I did have after I thought the very interesting retirement living standards session this morning, and although I've got some bit of an issue about it doesn't include housing and the tax, you know, wonder whether actually what the dashboard should be showing, in the same way as we show a lifetime allowance percentage on our SMPIs, could it show that, you know, this pension is likely to produce you 5% or 10% of that retirement living standard? And that might be an easy way of avoiding all the assumptions and actually giving members a very clear statement, because it almost wouldn't have the numbers on it. It would just say, if you're aiming for this middle range, these pensions are going to provide 5% or 50%, and then have a total at the bottom. And you could potentially see that as being really helpful. But I think the bottom line is we should walk before we run. If we could just have somewhere where somebody could go on and see all their pensions and have a link to the relevant address or website, I think that would be such a massive step forward for deferreds that we should all really get behind it and engage with Chris and his team to make sure it's fit for purpose.
Thank you, Ellie, very much indeed. We have had a raft of questions coming through. I think we're up to well into double figures now for questions. We only have 10 minutes to get through these, so I'm going to try and ask our panel to do them in as quick a fire way as possible to get through them, and I will offer you the chance to ask questions in the sort of traditional hands up way as well. So I'm going to start off, bit of an exam question for you here. Does the panel agree that a limited dashboard that found people's pension pots ASAP is better than the full Monty in the fullness of time? And please explain your answer. So, Nigel, over to you.
So you're working.
So it depends on what you mean by finding your pension and whether that includes having clear information about its value. But for me, that would be the best thing, to be able to find all your pensions and see their value. I think if it's only finding your pensions, that's okay, but it's a long way short of the aspiration of being able to help plan for retirement. But the version I said, I think, is worth going for. Things in the other things, like the ability to transfer between funds, etc. Good and exciting stuff for the future, but I don't think that's phase one.
Thank you, Ellie. You just answered perhaps some of that.
I think just finding your pension would be a massive step forward, and if that's the first baby step we take, so be it.
Chris, any ideas on minimal viable products?
Yeah, well, I don't know exactly what it will look like, but one thing that's clear to me is the dashboards will evolve over time. And you want to get something, there's a trade-off between getting something up quickly, which people will find useful, and waiting till you have everything you want and doing it there. So I think it's almost certain that we'll be looking at something which will just allow people to find their pension, to know where their pensions are, will be the first stage. Then it will be looking at how much is that pension worth, what's the value of doing that, and you may have stages where different types of pension can provide different parts of information if we think that would be useful to the individual in trying to find it. And then I think, as Nigel said, I think it's worth spelling out some of the other things we talk about. Projections is an important one, modelling tools, all those. I don't see that as being part of a dashboard. Those are tools which build on top of a dashboard and where the dashboard information feeds into it. So that doesn't mean that we don't have to worry about that, because actually there's some very important governance and regulatory issues that the dashboard will enable things to happen unless those governance and regulatory standards are there. So we can't ignore them. We've got to work very hard with all the interested parties to make sure that when the dashboard does provide this information to individuals and then they are able to do something with it, they're doing it in an environment that's safe for them to do so.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to cover off one or two quickly. Is a data specification available now so administrators can prepare their data? I think from what you said, Chris, the answer is no, but it's on your to-do list.
It's top of the list of things to do.
Super. Will it be compulsory for all schemes to take part? Yes. If the pension bill...
Assuming the pension bill becomes the Pensions Act, then yes, it will.
Thank you very much indeed. And turning to your point, Nigel, obviously when the Minister announced, the DWP announced the next stage of this in March, it was said that the state pension wouldn't be part of the initial phase. A question here, sort of why can't the state pension be here to start with? I'm asking you, Chris, I don't know if you want to...
I mean, there are so many moving parts in this, and as I said, one of the questions that we're grappling with is what's of use to consumers. And things will work on different tracks. As I said, the thing that's probably going to be the slowest track is data. It will take a long time, I think, for the whole of the industry to get all their data and everything they have ready to you have instantaneous access to valuations, for example, especially in DB, if that's ever going to be possible. So there's a whole range of different things to look at. The state pension is another one. There are very different issues with providing the state pension on a dashboard than there might be with providing private pensions on a dashboard, purely because some of it is working to different standards, working in a different part of the industry, and with different requirements. So I couldn't say whether the state pension will or will not be part of the first iteration of a dashboard, or whatever that is. It will depend on how long it takes to do these things, whether the advisory group can come to a view as to what is actually useful, and what we think actually is the best way to ensure that the dashboard ecosystem is helping people, but not in such a partial way that people actually are disappointed. Because the one thing we can't do is give them a poor product to start off with, because then there's a chance they'll never come back. So we've got to make sure that whatever we do at every stage of the way is the right thing to be doing. And I think, going back to something that Nigel said, it's really important that we get that right and take the time to get it right, rather than rush ahead to try and meet some deadline which may or may not have a kind of a value for a consumer, rather than having, say, a political or a commercial value.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take one or two questions from the floor. Yes, sir, thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
John Pantle, Greater Manchester Pension Fund. In the past, we've tended to focus on income at a retirement age, 65 or 67. However, I think the point you made about the vision for retirement, we've got to think, how do we provide information after retirement for older people? I meet as a local councillor lots of older people, and their worries. And Age UK had a money project. Is a way of at least building something that's realistic to help people think about planning during retirement, for the future. I'm 85, I'm okay, but...
Thank you very much indeed. If we take a second question there as well, perhaps put them both to the... Yes, thank you very much.
Dennis Gadsby, trustee of the Industry-Wide Coal Scheme. I'm almost thinking we ought to be able to manage disappointment here. Someone mentioned not showing the small pots, but then again, someone might be chuffed to bits, if you like, that have been paying 3 or 4 years into auto enrolment, and then be hugely disappointed because the amount that this generates as a pension only gives the family a day out in Blackpool every year, literally. It's so small an amount. So I think it's as I say, it's almost about managing a disappointment in that arena.
Thank you very much. So 2 questions there. Firstly, how can we use dashboards to help sort of people plan and sort of understand retirement? And secondly, how do we manage the disappointment that the dashboard may bring for consumers?
Okay, can I say, firstly, I can't see anyone can see a day out in Blackpool annually as a disappointment. I think it should be something we should aspire to. But it's, I mean, you're actually finding small pots is initially going to be a very important part of the dashboard project, because we are introducing this on the back of automatic enrolment since 2012. People have been automatically enrolled into pension schemes, great use of inertia, but at the same time, there will be potentially millions of people who either don't realise they have a pension for some of that period of time, or will already have 2 or 3 different pensions for part of that time. They may know who they worked for, but they may not know who the pension provider was at that stage. So actually, if they know where to go to find that information and can find that information, then it will help the situation we currently have at the moment, where £20 billion of money in DC is held by providers who do not know or cannot contact the individuals who own that asset. So it's really important that that works well. So small pots is a really important issue for the dashboard to work with. In terms of what happens as you go through retirement, it's a tricky one. And actually, one of the user cases we're thinking about is actually, what if someone's already retired and wants to use the dashboard? I mean, that's no reason why you couldn't do that. So that's something we're considering. International examples, I think, let me get this right, it's one of the Scandinavian countries. I think it's the Danish system. Actually doesn't just show, when it does projections, what happens when you get to the point of retirement, but shows the next 5 or 10 years as well beyond that, and shows how things can change when you do that. Now, I think, given the system we have, all of that functionality, if it does come into dashboards, is a long way away, and we may not want to get into that. I think the projections point, and having to use consistent projections, we have some real issues there about whether every provider does a projection on a consistent basis, and if you do that, what does that mean for how it compares with what they send out in the annual statement? You can't have the dashboard showing one thing and an annual statement showing another. but it all being trying to be consistent across providers. So there's some real thorny issues for us to go to. But I think actually helping people to look not just at the point of retirement, but all the way through their retirement is a really, really important policy question that dashboards can help with.
Thank you.
Just add
Yes.
one tiny point there, which is I think part of the whole issue about projections is that this whole concept of a retirement date, I just think is out. You know, there is no such thing. So how on earth are we going to manage that? You know, do we just pin it to the state pension date? I don't know, but I think we struggle with that all the time because people don't retire on one date anymore. That doesn't happen.
Thank you. Anything to add? In that case,
You go first next time.
ladies and gentlemen, I'm aware that we've got lots of unanswered questions to remain, but sadly we've run out of time for this session. If you could all join me in thanking our panellists, Chris Curry, Nigel Peaple and Ellie McKinnon. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.